It was the kind of cold that bit clean through a man's coat and settled deep in his bones. The late morning sun was a pale, watery disk struggling to pierce the thick, bruised-looking clouds, but it offered no warmth. My breath plumed out in frosty clouds with every exhale, and the crunch of snow under the hooves of our horses was the only sound for miles. I led the four-man column, my hands tucked into my gloves, resting lightly on the reins. The weight of my Winchester carbine was a familiar presence across the saddle. I wasn't in a hurry, but I wasn't wasting time either. Every minute mattered when lives were on the line, especially in this unforgiving winter landscape. I'm Owen Carver, 41 years old, tall and broad-shouldered from a lifetime of hard labor and even harder riding. The sun and wind had weathered my face into a roadmap of fine lines, and my hair, what little there was left of it, was the color of dust. I'd spent nearly 6 years as a scout for the Army, but I walked away when I could no longer reconcile their orders with my conscience. Since then, I'd made my living as a trail guide and a man people came to when the law was either too far or too slow. This time, the message had come from an old Army contact. A small Apache settlement was in trouble. Raiders had hit them, and these weren't men looking to trade. The 3 men riding behind me were all from my old unit: Tom Fletcher, a quiet man with a knack for tracking; Cole Markham, who could hit a bottle cap at 100 yards; and Harlan Tate, a big, steady rider who was good in a knife fight. They were men I trusted, men who had stood with me in rifle smoke more than once. They weren't here for pay. They were here because I had asked, and because the idea of a raid on a defenseless camp, especially one where women were taken, sat wrong with every last one of us. We crested a low, snow-dusted ridge, and the air changed. The wind, which had been a constant biting presence, died. In its place came a new smell: smoke. It was a sour, clinging odor that even the cold couldn't erase. I pulled my horse to a stop and stood in the stirrups for a better look. Below, pressed against the base of a jagged rock bluff, lay the Apache encampment. The sight of it made my chest tighten with a familiar cold dread. Half the lodges were collapsed, their hides blackened from fire. Twisted skeletal frames stood like mournful specters. Wreaths of smoke still curled from the embers of a few that had burned down to the ground. Scattered gear lay where it had been dropped in a panicked rush: baskets, overturned blankets, half buried in the trampled snow. There was no sign of livestock. No children laughing. The silence was heavier than the cold itself. The signs were clear. Whoever had done this hadn't left in a rush. They'd taken what they wanted, and they had done so with a brutal thoroughness. The tracks in the snow were a fresh, clear story of a terrible event. I swung down from the saddle, my boots crunching into the hard-packed ground. I motioned for the others to hold back, my rifle resting on my shoulder, but my right hand was loose and ready. I walked toward the camp slowly, deliberately, giving anyone who might be left a chance to see that I wasn't another threat. From the deep shadows of the bluff, a group of people emerged. Mostly women, a few elders, and 1 or 2 young men with bows held low, their faces grim and wary. They looked weary beyond words, but not ready to run. Not yet. Then a woman stepped forward. She was in her mid-20s, tall and lean, with the hard muscle of someone used to a life of riding and hard work. Her long black hair was tangled with wind and soot. She wore a deerskin dress, beaded along the hem, but one shoulder strap had been torn, letting the fabric slip low enough to reveal her collarbone and a scrape along her skin. There was a bruise at her temple, and her bare feet, despite the cold, were scuffed and raw from rock and dirt. She stopped a few paces from me, her eyes fixed on mine. There was exhaustion in them, but also a fierce, burning defiance. When she spoke, her voice was low and deliberate, her English clear though accented. "Save my people," she said, her voice a stark contrast to the quiet horror around us. "And I will give you strong offspring." Behind me, I heard Tom shift in his saddle and mutter under his breath, but I didn't react. I knew with a certainty that reached into my gut that her offer wasn't a joke to her. It wasn't a plea for herself. It was a bargain for her people, a desperate last-ditch attempt to secure their survival. I studied her face. I saw her pain, the fear she was pushing down, but most of all I saw her strength. She was hurt, she was cold, but she was standing straight. "What happened?" I asked, my voice as calm as I could make it. She didn't look at me, but toward the north ridge. 6 riders. 2 wagons. They took horses. They took women. My jaw tightened. 6 riders wasn't much if I could catch them right. But with wagons, they would be moving slow, leaving a clear trail. The real problem was the cold and the timing. The longer we waited, the further ahead those raiders would get, and the more the tracks would be filled in with new snow. I turned to my men. "We ride at dawn," I said. Tom frowned, his breath a white cloud. If they've got a day's head start, we ride at dawn, I repeated, my tone leaving no room for argument. I knew the danger, but I also knew what waiting meant for those poor women. For the rest of the evening, I moved through the camp. The cold was a constant companion, but the real chill was the fear clinging to the survivors. I checked the wounded, handing out what little water we had in our canteens, though it was half frozen. I knelt beside a small boy with a cracked lip, steadying the gourd with one hand as he drank. The woman, who I learned was named Nina, was doing the same for an older man with a cut on his forehead. At one point, our shoulders brushed, and for a fleeting moment, a spark of shared purpose passed between us. Neither of us pulled away. I didn't speak much that night. There was nothing to say. But in my mind, the decision had already been made. I wasn't here because she had offered me anything. I was here because walking away from people who needed help, no matter the color of their skin or the promises they made, was the kind of man I had once sworn I'd never become again. The sky was a pale, empty gray when I stepped away from the fire's dying glow. The cold was more intense in the pre-dawn hours, and the snow crunched with a brittle sound beneath my boots. I had been awake most of the night, listening to the muffled sounds of the camp. The low murmur of the elders, the whimpers of a baby, the faint shuffle of footsteps as people tried to rest without letting themselves fall too deep into a sleep that might be their last. I had seen enough of this to know that fear didn't vanish when the shooting stopped. It stayed in the air, heavy, waiting to see if the trouble would return. I walked to where Nina was squatting near the ashes, feeding a few thin sticks into the flames. She glanced up briefly, the firelight catching the bruise on her temple. She hadn't changed her torn dress or tried to hide the scrape on her collarbone. There was a hard pride in her refusal to hide her wounds. "You will ride?" she asked, her voice low. "Soon as there's light enough to see tracks," I replied. I took a long drink from my canteen, the icy water a sharp shock in my throat, then handed it to her. She drank, then passed it back without speaking. I studied her a moment longer. "How far behind are we?" I asked. She looked toward the ridge. "Half a day, maybe less. They took the north trail. There is water after 6 miles. They will stop there." I nodded. That answered one of the questions that had been gnawing at me. Raiders with women and wagons would always slow down for water. It meant we might be able to catch them before they reached a canyon or a deep cut in the land that could give them cover. Behind me, Tom was already saddling up our horses. "You sure it's only 6 riders?" he called. Nina's jaw tightened. 6 men. 2 wagons. The horses are ours. They have 2 rifles, the rest are pistols. I turned back to Tom. "That's enough to handle." I didn't add the rest of what I was thinking, that pistols meant they'd try to close the distance before firing, that they were likely disorganized and overconfident. Cole and Harlan came from the far side of the camp, leading the horses, which were stamping their hooves to keep warm. Both men looked tired but alert, their rifles already loaded. I went over the plan again. Ride hard until they hit the water. Dismount before the crest. Come in low and fast. Keep the fight close to stop them from harming the captives. No one argued. They all knew the stakes. As we mounted up, I looked back at the camp. A few children were watching from behind one of the half-burnt lodges. The elders stood further back, arms folded, their expressions unreadable. Nina was still by the fire. When I met her eyes, she gave one short, firm nod. We rode north, following the tracks in the snow. The desert here was open, the ground hard and pale beneath the dusting of white. The wagon wheels had left deep, clear lines, and the horse prints overlapped them, heading straight toward the low hills. By mid-morning, I raised my hand to slow the pace. The sound of trickling water, half-frozen and crystalline, carried on the cold wind. I signaled the others to dismount. We tied the horses in a shallow, snow-filled wash, then moved up the slope on foot, keeping low. The cold was a constant gnawing presence, but the adrenaline was a hot flame in my veins. From the ridge, I saw them. 6 men and 2 wagons, just as Nina had said. The wagons were pulled up near a narrow stream, its banks coated in ice, shaded by cottonwoods with bare twisted branches. 3 women were tied near the back wheel of the first wagon. 2 men were filling canteens. One was tending to a horse's leg, and another stood on watch, a rifle slung lazily over his shoulder, his breath pluming in the frigid air. I checked my men's positions. Cole would take the man on watch, Tom the one at the stream, Harlan the one by the horse. I would go straight for the wagons. The last 2 raiders, wherever they were, would have to be handled fast. I gave the signal. The first shots cracked sharp in the morning stillness, echoing off the bluff behind us. The man with the rifle dropped where he stood. The one at the stream spun and fell back into the water, his canteen spilling icy liquid. I was already running my rifle up, shouting for the women to get low. One raider lunged from behind the wagon with a pistol firing wild. The bullets snapped past my ear, the cold air hissing with their passage. I fired once and the man fell, his gun skittering into the dirt. The last two came from the cottonwoods shouting. Cole cut one down with a clean shot to the chest. The other turned to run, but Harlan was on him before he made it 10 steps, a brutal, efficient shadow. When it was quiet, I went to the women. I cut their ropes, the leather stiff and cold, and told them to keep their heads down. One of them clung to my arm for a moment, shaking, and I eased her toward the stream where Tom was already filling extra canteens. We checked the wagons, finding stolen goods, 2 bags of maize, some grain. I found a sack of ammunition, mostly .44 rounds, and took it, splitting it between us. The ride back was slower. The rescued women were weak from cold and hunger. I gave my canteen to the youngest and walked my horse beside her, giving her my coat until we reached the bluff. When we rode in, Nina was there, standing apart from the others. Her eyes went first to the women, counting them, making sure. Then they went to me. She didn't smile, but the tension in her face eased like ice breaking. "You kept your word," she said. I didn't answer, just nodded, stepping down from my horse and leading it toward the shade. I was already thinking about the next step, because raiders like these didn't act alone. Someone out there had sent them. The heat, even what little there was, had lingered long enough to make the air inside the bluff feel close and heavy. The rescued women were given water, food, and blankets. Some sat in the shade, speaking softly in their own tongue. Others rested near the half-collapsed lodges, too tired to move. I walked the camp slowly, checking every face. I had seen enough raids to know that survivors sometimes carried wounds no one noticed until it was too late. The kind that broke a spirit as surely as a bullet broke a bone. Nina was crouched beside one of the younger women, pressing a damp cloth to her wrist where rope burns had broken the skin. She looked up when I approached. "She will be fine," Nina said quietly, her eyes weary but her voice steady. "But she needs rest." I nodded, my eyes moving over the camp. The cold was a constant drain, and fear was a poison that seeped into everything. I had questions that hadn't been answered yet. The tracks of the raiders had been too clean, their approach too easy. They'd known the camp's position, the number of horses, even where the lodges stood. That kind of knowledge didn't come from guessing. "Someone told them where to find you," I said, my voice low. Nina's expression changed. Not surprise, but recognition. She glanced toward the elders seated in a small group near the rock wall. "One man left the camp 3 weeks ago," she said. "He argued with the elders about trade. He wanted more rifles. They told him no." Her eyes hardened. "He went east." I filed that away. It was the first real lead. Raiders didn't always work alone. Sometimes they were the hand for someone else's coin. Tom came up from the north trail, dust and snow clinging to his shirt, carrying a saddlebag. "You want to see this?" he said, handing me a folded piece of paper. I opened it. Inside was a ledger page torn from a larger book. At the top was a name I recognized, Calder Nash. He was a ranch foreman with a reputation for paying men to do his dirty work. The page listed supplies, horses, and an amount in gold. It was dated just days before the raid. I didn't say much. I simply handed the paper to Nina so she could see. Her jaw tightened again. "He'll come back," she said. "He might," I replied, "but not tonight." Before dark, I gathered the elders, my own men, and a few of the younger braves. I explained the likely connection between Nash and the raid. I laid out the reality. The camp was vulnerable, and they had 2 choices: move to another location or prepare to hold this one. The elders spoke quietly among themselves, the words a low guttural murmur in the cold air. Then one of them said what I had already suspected: "The burial ground is here. The water is close." Moving meant leaving both behind. That decided it. They would stay. I spent the next hour walking the perimeter with the young braves, showing them how to use the terrain. I pointed out where brush could be piled to block sight lines, where a low wall of stone could be stacked to break a mounted charge. I marked shallow trenches that could trip a horse without trapping a man on foot. Later, when the light was gone and the fire burned low, I sat apart cleaning my rifle. Nina came to me carrying a bowl of steaming stew. The warmth of it was a welcome reprieve from the cold. She set it down beside me without a word. I picked it up, ate a few spoonfuls, then said, "Tomorrow I'll send 2 men to the trading post for supplies. The rest of us will start building defenses." She watched me for a moment, then sat beside me close enough that the torn edge of her dress brushed my arm. "Why do you stay?" she asked. I thought about it. I could have given her the easy answer that it was because of the offer she had made when we first met. But that wasn't it. Because I've seen what happens when no one does, I said finally. She didn't reply, but her hand stayed on her knee, just touching my leg until the fire was nothing but embers and the night was quiet. The morning came with a clear, dry sky, the air cool enough to make my breath visible for a short moment before the heat of the day came. I was already up checking the perimeter and the condition of the guards who had been posted through the night. The young braves had stayed alert. No tracks came near the bluff during the dark hours. That was good. It meant Nash or his hired riders weren't moving yet, but I knew that wouldn't last. By the time the rest of the camp stirred, I had already laid out the next steps in my head. The elders wanted to know what could be done to keep the camp from falling to another raid. Some of the younger men asked if the army could be called for help, but I told them plain. The nearest post was 2 days away, and there was no guarantee the soldiers would see protecting an Apache camp as their problem. That answer was not what they wanted to hear, but it was the truth. Tom and Cole volunteered to ride to the trading post with a list of supplies: sacks of flour, salt, coffee, more ammunition, nails, rope, and canvas. I also told them to see if anyone had heard about Nash's movements, whether he was gathering more men or heading elsewhere. They left before mid-morning, following the trail north the snow, a silent witness to their departure. While they were gone, I set the others to work. I had the younger braves carry rocks to build a low wall along the most exposed side of the camp. Older men dug shallow trenches where the ground sloped just deep enough to break a horse's stride. Women gathered brush to stack in piles that could be set alight if needed. Everyone had a task, a purpose. Nina worked alongside the others, carrying stones despite the bruising on her shoulder and the raw skin on her feet. I noticed she never complained, even when her hands were raw from the rough rock. Once, when she stopped to rest, I walked over and handed her a canteen. She took it, drank, and met my eyes for a long moment before passing it back. "This is our home," she said simply. "I will not leave it." The heat rose through the day, but the cold lingered in the shadows. Sweat darkened my shirt, and dust and grit clung to my skin. Still, the work continued. I walked the lines, adjusting where a wall curved, checking that firing positions had a clear line of sight. In between, I kept thinking about the name in the ledger, Calder Nash. I had crossed paths with men like him before. Not brave enough to fight their own battles, but willing to pay others to spill blood. Nash would not let this raid end with a loss. He'd be back to finish what he started. Late in the afternoon, Harlan returned from scouting the Western Trail. He reported wagon tracks heading toward Nash's ranch and fresh horse prints alongside them. "Could be resupply," Harlan said. "Or he's bringing in more men." I took that as confirmation. We had less time than I hoped. That evening, the camp gathered around the central fire. The elders spoke in their language, then turned to me. One of them asked me directly why I would risk staying here, why I cared about this fight. It was a question others had likely been wondering since my arrival. I didn't give them a long story. "Because I've been in places like this," I said, my voice low and steady. "And I've seen what happens when good men walk away. I'm not doing that again." The elders seemed to accept it. As the firelight flickered, Nina brought me a clay bowl of stew. She didn't leave right away, but sat beside me, knees bent, hands folded in her lap. For a while, neither of us spoke. The sounds of the camp filled the space, the crackle of the fire, a child's soft laugh from one of the lodges, the murmur of voices. Finally, Nina glanced toward me. "If Nash comes, we will fight," she asked. I looked at her, my gaze steady. "We'll fight, and we'll make sure he doesn't come back." She studied my face for a moment, as if measuring whether I meant it. Then she nodded once and stayed there beside me until the fire burned low and the night settled quiet over the bluff. The next morning, the sky was a pale wash of blue, the air cool enough to make my breath visible for a short moment before the heat came. I was already up checking the trench lines and the new sections of stone wall. I ran my hand along one part of the wall, shifting a loose rock into place. It would hold against a charge. It had to. Tom and Cole had not yet returned from the trading post. I didn't like that. The trip there and back was only a day's ride if a man kept a steady pace. It left me thinking about what could slow them: a broken wagon wheel, a meeting with the wrong people, or worse, a run-in with Nash's men before they could get home. Still, there was nothing to do but keep building. The younger braves were learning quickly. I had them reinforcing the wall with more brush and dirt to catch bullets. I set up firing points that were staggered so defenders wouldn't block each other's line of sight. Women cut strips of cloth from old blankets to use as bandages. Water skins were filled and set in shaded places. I didn't tell them to be ready for a siege, but I planned for one all the same. By mid-morning, the sound of hooves came from the north trail. I stepped up onto a flat rock, my rifle resting across my forearm, and waited until I saw two riders, Tom in front, Cole behind with a pack mule. They came in covered in dust and snow, but both were upright and alert. I met them halfway, and Tom wasted no time. We got the supplies, but Nash knows you're here. Cole untied the mule's packs while Tom went on. Word in the post is he's been paying drifters in gold to ride with him. They say he's bragging that he'll take back every horse and burn this camp to the ground before the month's out. I didn't look surprised. How many men? Tom shrugged. Could be a dozen. Could be more if he empties his pockets. That confirmed what I already suspected. Nash wasn't going to send a small party this time. He'd come in with enough to try and scare them into leaving or dying where they stood. I called the elders together, explained what Tom had heard, and told them they still had a choice. Leave now or stand and fight. The oldest among them didn't hesitate. Our dead are here. Our water is here. We stay. Nina stood behind them as they spoke. When the meeting broke, she came to me. He will come soon, she said. Then we'll be ready, I replied. That afternoon they worked harder. I had the men place sharpened stakes in the ground behind the trenches. The women stacked stones inside baskets to throw down if riders breached the wall. Children were kept close to the bluff's back wall out of sight. Everyone knew their role. As the sun dropped low, I walked the camp one last time. Nina was at the water pots refilling them with a small group of women. She had tied her hair back and cleaned the dirt from her face. The torn strap of her dress still hung loose at her shoulder, the fringe moving in the breeze. When she saw me, she paused. You think we can win? She asked. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. We don't have to win big. We just have to hit them hard enough they don't want to come back. She studied me, her eyes searching for doubt. She didn't find any. Then I will fight too, she said. I didn't argue. I knew better than to tell her no. Instead, I handed her a short rifle from the wagon and showed her how to check the chamber, where to place her feet, how to steady her aim. She learned fast. By nightfall, the camp was quiet. The fire was kept low to hide their numbers. I sat near the wall, rifle across my knees, scanning the darkness. Somewhere out there, Nash was gathering his men. I could almost feel it, the weight of what was coming. But I also felt something else when I thought of Nina's steady gaze and the way the camp had started to move as one. They were no longer just waiting to be hit. They were ready. The next day broke still. The kind of stillness that made men listen harder than they meant to. I was up before first light, walking the lines, checking every stake and wall segment. The trenches were set, the sharpened stakes hidden behind them, water skins placed where fighters could reach them without leaving cover. I stopped at the east side and studied the horizon. The land rolled away in low, snow-dusted ridges and pale dirt flats. Nothing moving yet, but my gut told me it wouldn't stay that way. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, the camp was awake. Women gathered the children close to the bluff, out of the line of fire. Older men checked weapons, while the younger braves stood at their posts with a mix of focus and restlessness. I noticed the way some of them shifted their feet too much, the way others gripped their rifles too tight. I'd seen it before. The weight of waiting could fray a man's edge before the fight even began. I moved along the line, speaking to each one in turn, my voice low and steady, giving short practical reminders. Breathe. Keep your muzzle low until you're sure. Wait for the call. Tom approached from the north trail, his face set. I saw dust maybe 6 miles out, he reported. Looked like riders, but too far to count. I nodded. Then they're coming. That was all I said, but the words carried through the camp. People straightened their backs. The pace of the work shifted faster, sharper. Nina crossed the camp toward me, the rifle I'd given her slung across her shoulder. She had tied a strip of cloth around her hair to keep it out of her eyes. The torn strap of her dress was now knotted, but the bruise at her temple was still visible. How long, she asked. Couple of hours, maybe less, I answered. I studied her for a moment. You know your position, she nodded. By the low wall near the center where you said. I didn't doubt she would hold her ground, but I also knew what a first fight could do to someone. Stay low. Don't waste your shots. And if I tell you to move, you move. She met my gaze without flinching. I will not run. The camp settled into silence again. Men checked their weapons one last time. I had Cole take the high notch overlooking the northern approach, giving him the best line of sight for the first warning shots. Tom stayed with me near the center. Harlan took the far west side. Around mid-morning, the first glint of sunlight off metal appeared on the horizon. Then the shapes of riders formed. 15 at least, spreading out in a loose line. My jaw tightened. They were coming slow, deliberate, the way men rode when they wanted to be seen and feared. At the center of the line was Calder Nash, a red sash tied to his throat, sitting high in the saddle. I stepped up to the wall where I could be seen. I rested my rifle across the top and waited. When Nash and his men closed to speaking distance, Nash called out, "You've got something of mine. Horses, women, goods. Hand them over and maybe I'll let you walk away." I didn't move. The horses are theirs. The women are theirs. Nothing here belongs to you. Nash's grin was thin. "You really think you can stop me?" "I don't think I said." "I know." The pause after that was short. Nash lifted his hand and the riders spread wider. One man fired a pistol into the air, the sound cracking through the stillness. I raised my voice just enough for my own line to hear. "Hold." The riders came closer. When the first crossed the shallow trench, the horse's front legs buckled, sending it and its rider tumbling. That was the signal. Cole's rifle barked from the notch, dropping one man from the saddle. I fired next, hitting another who was trying to skirt the trench. The air filled with the sharp, flat crack of rifles, the shouts of men, the pounding of hooves. Nina's rifle sounded from the low wall, steady, controlled. I glanced away once and saw her reloading with quick, sure hands, her face a mask of fierce concentration. A rider tried to flank the wall, but she caught him clean the shot, snapping him backward in the saddle before he slid into the dirt. The fight was quick but hard. 2 of Nash's men lay dead. 3 more wounded. The rest pulled back, wheeling their horses and riding out of range. Nash stayed long enough to look at me with a promise in his eyes before turning away. When the dust settled, I walked the line, checking every position. No one from the camp had been killed. A few had grazes from bullets, nothing more. I stopped at Nina's spot. She was sitting back on her heels, rifle across her lap, breathing hard but steady. When I crouched beside her, she looked at me and said simply, "We did not run." I gave a short nod. No, we didn't. But I knew Nash wasn't finished. By the time the last of Nash's riders disappeared beyond the ridgeline, the camp had gone still again. The gunpowder smell hung in the warm air, sharp and metallic. I stayed where I was until Cole came down from the high notch and confirmed the enemy was truly gone. Only then did I give the signal for the women and children to come out from the bluff's shadow. The wounded were brought to the central fire. Most were lucky shallow cuts, grazed shoulders, a cracked rib from a fall behind the wall. I moved between them, checking each injury, offering water where it was needed. I had seen enough fights to know that tending to the hurt quickly wasn't just about healing. It steadied the camp's nerves. People needed to see that no one had been left behind. Tom crouched beside me, his voice low. "Nash didn't bring everything he had. You saw that, right?" I nodded. "He was testing us. Now he knows the layout, the wall, the trenches. Next time he'll come in harder and smarter." "What's our move?" Tom asked. I glanced toward the bluff where the women were helping patch the wall. "We make it so whatever he brings next time still isn't enough." As the camp got back to work, I noticed Nina. She was standing by the low wall where she had fought, her rifle still in her hands. Her hair had come loose from the strip of cloth she'd tied it with, and a thin streak of soot marked her cheek. She wasn't shaking. If anything, she looked sharper, more alert than before. I walked over. "You shoot steady," I said. "I hit the man on the bay horse," she replied without hesitation. "He will not ride fast again." I studied her for a moment, weighing something in my mind. Most people's hands shake after their first fight. "My hand shook when they took our people," she said flatly. "Not now." Her words settled into me. It was clear she wasn't fighting just because the camp was in danger. She was fighting because this was her line and she had decided it wouldn't move again. By late afternoon, we had repaired the worst of the wall. Cole and Harlan moved more brush into position and reset the stakes. I had the young braves practice reloading and firing from behind cover, forcing them to keep their heads low and conserve rounds. I saw in their faces a new kind of focus. The shock of their first fight was already turning into a harder edge. At the evening meal, the elders spoke briefly. They thanked me and my men for standing with them and confirmed what everyone already knew: Nash would return. No one spoke of leaving. The choice to stay was final now. When darkness came, I made my rounds again. The fires were kept low. The guards were doubled on each side. I found Nina sitting near the bluff's edge, her rifle laid across her lap. She was looking out toward the north where the land dipped into shadow. "You should rest," I told her. "I will when he is gone for good," she answered. Then after a pause, she added, "You could leave, you know. No one would call you a coward. This is not your fight." I sat down beside her. "I've walked away from too many fights that should have been mine. I'm not making that mistake again." We sat in silence for a while. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called. The sound echoed off the rock walls. Nina shifted her knee brushing against mine. "When this is over," she said quietly, "I want you to stay. Not for a promise I made before. For now." I didn't answer right away. I looked out into the darkness, the shape of the land lit faintly by the moon. Then I said, "Let's get through what's coming. After that we'll decide what staying means." For the first time that day, she allowed herself the smallest smile. The next 2 days passed with no sign of Nash, but I knew better than to think the fight was over. The quiet felt too heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. I used the time to push the camp harder. Every trench was deepened, every firing position checked, every water pot kept full. Ammunition was counted twice a day. The younger braves drilled until they could reload without looking down at their hands. At first light on the third day, Cole came down from the high notch with his jaw tight. "Dust trail on the northern flats," he said. "Big one. Could be 20 riders, maybe more." I didn't waste time asking questions I already knew the answer to. I sent Tom to gather the elders and Harlan to check the stakes and brush piles. Cole stayed in the notch to keep eyes on the movement. Within minutes, the camp was in motion. Women carried children to the back of the bluff. The wounded from the first fight were moved to cover and the fighters took their positions. I found Nina at the low wall already loading her rifle. She wore the same deerskin dress, its strap knotted from the tear, but she had tied a band of cloth around her arm where the recoil had bruised her in the last fight. Her hair was pulled back tight, and her expression left no doubt she was ready. "Same position?" she asked. "Same position," I confirmed. I hesitated, then added, "If they break the wall, you fall back to the bluff. No arguments." She gave me a sharp look. "If they break the wall, I will still be here." There was no time to argue. The riders were visible now, a long line of dust and glinting steel under the sun. Nash was again at the center, but this time his line was thicker, tighter. He meant to hit hard and keep hitting. The first shots came from Cole's notch sharp and measured, forcing the lead riders to swerve. I waited until they were within range of the trenches before giving the order to fire. The wall lit with rifle cracks. Horses screamed as they stumbled into the hidden pits. Men shouted, trying to close the gap. Nash's men kept coming, using the fallen horses as cover. I shifted position to plug a gap where 2 braves had been forced back. I fired twice, hitting a man in the chest and sending another sprawling. Bullets struck the wall around me, splintering stone. From the corner of my eye, I saw Nina fire, reload, and fire again, each shot deliberate. A rider tried to flank the wall, but she caught him clean the shot, snapping him backward in the saddle before he slid into the dirt. The fight lasted longer this time. Close to 20 minutes of hard shooting and shouted orders. Then finally, the line began to falter. Nash pulled his men back, retreating under covering fire. I didn't lower my rifle until the dust trail was moving away for good. My ears rang from the gunfire, and the acrid burn of powder hung thick in my throat. When the shooting stopped, the camp took stock. 2 of their own had been killed and 3 more were wounded, one badly. I knelt beside the worst of them, a young brave with a chest wound, and pressed a cloth to the bleeding. I kept pressure on it until the women could take over. Nina came to me afterward, her face streaked with sweat and soot. "We held," she said. "We held," I agreed. I looked toward the horizon where Nash had vanished. "But he'll think about whether it's worth coming back." "And if he does?" she asked. My gaze went back to her. "If he does, we finish it." For a moment we stood there in the heat, surrounded by the smell of dust and smoke, the sound of quiet voices tending to the wounded. Then I reached for her shoulder, a brief grounding touch before turning to walk the line again. I needed to see every position with my own eyes. Nash might be gone for now, but I had been in enough fights to know that a man like that didn't walk away without leaving some unfinished business behind. The morning after the second fight, the camp was quiet but uneasy. I could see it in the way people moved slower, with more glances toward the horizon than usual. Even in victory, they knew Nash was the kind of man who didn't like to leave a fight unfinished. I had the same thought. I doubted Nash would walk away and call it a loss. If he was smart, he'd try something different. Maybe at night, maybe by cutting off their water. I met with the elders as the sun cleared the ridge. I told them they had 2 choices: wait for Nash to make his next move or take it from him. The elders didn't speak for long before agreeing. Ending it now was better than letting him choose the terms. I decided we would ride for Nash's ranch that same day before he had time to gather more men. I selected my riders carefully: Tom, Cole, Harlan, and 3 of the younger braves who had proven themselves in the last fight. We carried extra ammunition, water, and enough food for a long day's work. Nina wanted to go, but I shook my head. If something goes wrong, someone has to lead here, I told her. She didn't like it, but she understood. By mid-morning, we were in the saddle heading north. The trail to Nash's place was wide and dusty, cutting through open flats and low ridges. I kept us moving at a steady pace, avoiding talk. I was thinking about every possible way the fight could go wrong. We reached the outer edge of Nash's land just after midday. A few riders patrolled the fence lines, but nothing heavy. I led us in low through a dry wash circling to the rear of the ranch house where a small corral held most of Nash's stock. We came in fast, a sharp whistle, the thud of boots hitting dirt. And then it was over in seconds. The guards went down without a shot fired. One was smart enough to drop his rifle and run. Tom and I kicked in the back door of the ranch house. Inside, Nash was at a table halfway through a bottle, his red sash tossed over a chair. He froze when he saw me, then went for the revolver at his hip. I was faster. One shot punched into the wall beside Nash's head, close enough to splinter the wood. "You're finished," I said. My voice was low flat. "You come near that camp again, you don't walk away." Nash's face twitched, but he saw the truth in my eyes. "You think you can tell me what land I can take?" "I'm not telling you," I said. "I'm making sure you understand." I nodded to Tom, who stepped forward and took Nash's pistol. Cole brought in one of the braves to stand watch while the others rounded up the remaining men and sent them down the road on foot. We left Nash alive but stripped of every horse in the corral and every rifle in the house. I knew that without men or mounts, Nash's power in the territory was gone. The message was clear, and men like Nash didn't need more than one. By the time we rode back into the bluff, the sun was dipping low. The camp gathered as the riders came in the sight of the extra horses, drawing murmurs of relief. I dismounted and went straight to Nina. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning me quickly for wounds. When she found none, she let out a breath she'd been holding. "It's over," I told her. "He won't come back." The relief in the camp was immediate. Shoulders unknotted, voices lifted. The elders thanked me and my men openly, something they rarely did in front of others. That night a fire was built bigger than any they had dared since the first raid. Food was shared, songs were sung, and for the first time in weeks people laughed without looking over their shoulders. Later, when most had gone to their lodges, Nina and I stayed by the fire. She leaned in close, her hand resting on mine. "You said you'd decide what staying means after it was done," she said quietly. I turned to her. "It means I'm not going anywhere." Her hand tightened over mine. She smiled then. Not the small guarded smile she had given me before, but one that was warm and sure. "Then you stay," she said. In the days that followed, the camp returned to its rhythm. The wall stayed up, the trenches stayed dug, but the air was lighter. I helped rebuild the burned lodges and put a roof on the one Nina and I would share. In time, people stopped calling me the white man who helped and started calling me by my name. By early autumn, the camp was stronger than it had been before the raids. And in the quiet evenings when the work was done, Nina and I would sit on the bluff, looking out over the land we had fought to hold, knowing we had kept it and each other for good. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.